Technology triumphant, Europeans rule the world. In the East, an ancient power throws down a challenge. But the white man has turned his technology on himself. In the space of 30 years, he will drag humanity into 2 world wars. Montana, 1876. Sioux and Northern Cheyenne camp at the Little Bighorn River under their chiefs Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Gall. For the U.S. government, the American Plains Indians stand in the way of westward expansion. The Army's mission is to clear a path for the white man all the way to the Pacific. In June 1876, General George Armstrong Custer is ordered to drive the Sioux and Cheyenne into a government reservation. On the morning of June 25th, Custer's Crow Indian scouts report an Indian village of 7,000. At least 2,000 of them are warriors. Custer has only 600 cavalrymen, but he is confident that the discipline and firepower of a modern army will outmatch mere savages. He sent 2 companies to scout the Indian position, one under Major Marcus Reno, the other under Captain Frederick Benteen. Crossing the Little Bighorn, Reno's column of 140 was set upon by a bigger force of Indians, among them a young Cheyenne named Wooden Leg.
I fired 4 shots with my 6-shooter. I do not know whether any of my bullets did harm. I saw a Sioux put an arrow into the back of a soldier's head. Another arrow went into his shoulder. He tumbled from his horse to the ground.
Reno retreated in disorder across the river, losing nearly half his men. The Indians moved downriver, hoping to cut him off. Custer was on a ridge high above the river, increasingly cut off from his 2 company commanders. Further upstream, Benteen's company was scouting for Indians. Seeing none, they made their way back toward the river. Benteen and Reno joined forces. By now, they had completely lost touch with Custer. Uncertain of Reno and Benteen's position, Custer decided to attack on his own. Chief Gall and his troops had been chasing Reno, but when they saw Custer attack, they changed direction. Custer scribbled a quick note and sent a messenger. "Benteen, come on. Big village. Be quick. Bring packs." The ground was covered in sagebrush. It was easy for the Indians to take cover. Chief Gall sent for reinforcements led by Chief Crazy Horse. Too late, Custer realized how badly he was outnumbered. Benteen was not coming. He would have to go it alone. The cavalry dismounted and took up rifle positions. Indians attacked on horseback and on foot. Those on foot crept unseen toward Custer. Wooden Leg was among them.
The Indians all the time could see where were the soldiers, because the white men were mostly on a ridge and their horses were with them. But the soldiers could not see our warriors, as they had left their ponies and were crawling in the gullies through the sagebrush. In a few minutes, the warriors were all around these soldiers. Chief Lame White Man called out, "Come, we can kill all of them." Right away, all of the white men went crazy. Instead of shooting us, they turned their guns upon themselves. Almost before we could get to them, every one of them was dead. They killed themselves.
The Indians had won a battle. They would not win the war. 1 year after Little Bighorn, the U.S. Army destroyed Crazy Horse's village with 2 light cannon. Crazy Horse surrendered without a fight. On another continent, the British were facing the last resistance from native peoples in South Africa. There the Zulus, under the warrior king Cetewayo, mounted one last stand against the British. The Zulu tactic was to approach the enemy at a lope, almost like a cavalry charge, without horses. When the Zulus hurled their spears at the British, it was like Roman legions meeting a gunpowder army. And sometimes they won. In January 1879, 3 years after Little Bighorn, Cetewayo launched a surprise attack at Isandlwana. 1,700 British were killed. Like Crazy Horse in America, Cetewayo was doomed. 6 months later, he was defeated at Ulundi. For the British, it was the end of black military threat in South Africa. After Ulundi, the British had nothing left to fear from the Zulu, but they faced a different tribal enemy, the white tribe of Africa, the Boers. The Boer War, fought from 1899 to 1902, was over high stakes. The diamond and gold mines of South Africa, and the country's commanding position of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. The Boers were descendants of 17th century Dutch colonists. They were tough, individualistic people, as wary of the British as they were of the Africans. The Boers were farmers. Their home was the veldt, a vast expanse of grassland like the Asian steppe. Extreme climate, difficult terrain. The Boers knew every inch of it. They were magnificent horsemen. and they had the latest long-range rifles. Man for man, the Boers were better marksmen than the British. On December 15, 1899, they clashed at the Battle of Colenso. The British suffered more than 1,000 casualties and lost 11 guns. Boer losses numbered 50. Using hit-and-run guerrilla tactics, the Boers won battle after battle, confounding the British government, who'd promised a short war with troops home by Christmas. The British had 25,000 troops in South Africa. Eventually, 500,000 British soldiers would fight there. The Boers never had more than 83,000 men available at any time. In November 1899, the Boers laid siege to the British garrison at Ladysmith. Over 4 months, 3,200 men died in its defense. But the tide turned in favor of the British. Money, sheer numbers, and the will to win at any cost brought victory in May 1902. The cost had been high. The death toll was 22,000 British against 4,000 Boers. America and Britain didn't worry about the human cost of their 19th century wars. The Americans were in charge of their own destiny. Britain controlled the richest empire in history. It seemed there was no stopping the Western powers and the dominance of their way of life. In February 1904, Japanese torpedo boats launched a surprise attack against Russia, wrecking almost half her fleet. No warning, no declaration of war, just a deliberate and devastating act of aggression. Newly modernized Japan challenged European military supremacy. Port Arthur was Russia's only year-round ice-free port in the Far East. On February 8th, the Japanese laid siege to it. With the blockade of Port Arthur, Russian naval reinforcements steaming from Europe would have no base. The next step in the Japanese war plan was to destroy the Russian army. The Japanese army of 283,000 men took on a Russian army of 4.5 million. They were outnumbered 15-1. Despite heavy losses, the Japanese kept up the siege of Port Arthur. The last stronghold fell on New Year's Day, 1905. 10,000 starving Russian troops surrendered. As the 20th century opened, new weapons would be tested in the century's first conflict between two modern armies. One was long-range artillery. The other was the machine gun, which would become a vital part of infantry in two world wars. The Japanese fought fearlessly. They suffered 59,000 casualties at Port Arthur, compared with 31,000 Russians. Japan was a force to be reckoned with. The final battle in the Russo-Japanese War was Tsushima, fought on May 27, 1905. It was the greatest naval battle of annihilation since Trafalgar, a century before. The Russians under Admiral Rozhestvensky brought their Baltic fleet to relieve Port Arthur. Japanese Admiral Togo lay in wait off the Korean coast near Busan. The Japanese ships were superior in speed and guns. After 2 days of fighting, 2/3 of the Russian fleet was sunk, and all but 3 remaining ships captured.
The impact on Western opinion of the Japanese defeat of the Russians was startling. The Europeans and Americans had recognized from early on in their encounter with the Japanese that these were not an Asian people like others. They had extraordinary unity and discipline. But nevertheless, their ability, after only 50 years of encounter with Western technology, to not merely use but to create Western-style technology themselves was a startling surprise to the West.
Western journalists traveled halfway around the world to see the fight. But the most curious of all were the foreign generals who came to see the new war technology. Nine years after this picture was taken, these men would fight each other in the First World War. On August 21, 1914, 3 airplanes of the British Royal Flying Corps spotted German cavalry heading toward the Belgian mining town of Mons. The airplane was a new invention, but here, after only a week of war, the new machine found a military role by spotting Germans where no Germans should have been, in neutral Belgium. Next day, the British responded. Horsemen of the 4th Dragoon Guards attacking German cuirassiers, killing several with their swords and pursuing the rest until they encountered a battalion of German riflemen on bicycles. Horsemen, once the elite force of the world's battlefields, were sent out to fight by an airplane and repelled by men on bicycles. This would be the first war of the machine age. The German troops at Mons hadn't strayed into neutral Belgium by accident. On that late summer day, the Germans were advancing toward France in accordance with a carefully worked out strategy, the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was aimed at Germany's 2 potential enemies, Russia and France, and it rested on 2 assumptions. 1, the Russians would need 6 weeks to put an army in the field, and 2, 6 weeks was long enough to defeat France. For a sudden knockout blow against France, surprise was the key. The surprise was France did not expect an attack through neutral Belgium. The German army rolled into Belgium and prepared to invade France. With everything running to timetable, the German staff felt confident the war would be over by Christmas. What they didn't know was that Field Marshal Sir John French, Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, had unwittingly moved his troops right into the path of the German First Army. The sun was shining that Sunday morning at Mons. The British outpost line was well hidden. It ran through the slag heaps of the coal mines and out along the canal. British troops were visible to the attacking Germans only at the exposed bridgeheads. It was here that the war would see one of its earliest acts of valor. Defending the most vulnerable of the Mons bridges was a section of the Royal Fusiliers under Lieutenant Morris Dees. Keeping watch on the bridge itself was Private S.F. Godley.
During the time I was on the bridge, before the actual action started, a little boy and girl came up on the bridge and brought me some rolls and coffee. I was thoroughly enjoying their rolls and coffee and talking to the children the best I could. And the Germans started shelling. So I said to this little boy and girl, "You better sling your hooks now, otherwise you may get hurt."
As the shelling intensified, waves of German infantry attacked the bridge. Lieutenant Dees and his men fired frantically at the enemy, but they were only one platoon faced by the entire might of the German Ninth Corps. They suffered terrible casualties. With his men dying around him, Lieutenant Dees took over the machine gun. Soon after, he was killed. It was now up to Private Godley.
We carried on until towards evening, when the order was given for the line to retire. I was then asked to remain and hold the position while the retirement took place, which I did do, although I was very badly wounded several times, but I managed to carry on. Then I was on my own at the latter end of the action. First Lieutenant Dees lay dead side of me.
With his comrades dead around him and his ammunition spent, Private Godley completed his mission by destroying the machine gun. The bravery of his unit allowed the entire British line to withdraw safely. Private Godley was taken prisoner, the sole survivor of the action. He and Lieutenant Dees were awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for valor. "32 nations would throw their industrial might against each other in the bloodiest war the world had ever seen. 4 years and 3 months later, 10 million men lay dead. Like the Germans, the British who died at Mons in August 1914 expected to be home by Christmas. Lieutenant Dees was buried in this military cemetery in France. Beside him lies Private Price, who was killed 4 years later, the last British casualty of the war. Lieutenant Dees never learned of mustard gas, trench warfare, submarines, tanks and fighter aircraft. For Private Price, laid by his side, such things were already history. July 1916. The First World War grinds on. More and more men are called to the front. To keep up the supply, Britain recruits PALS battalions, young men who know each other from office or factory, from football team or hometown. The British have recruited this way deliberately. They hope that existing comradeship will help their troops face the horrors of what's to come, the Battle of the Somme. When the PALS battalions arrived in France, the trenches of the Western Front already stretched over 500 miles from the North Sea to Switzerland. In front of each trench, tangles of barbed wire waited to snare attacking troops. Machine guns firing 600 rounds a minute covered every inch of ground in front of the barbed wire. In this war, the infantry charge was suicide. This wasn't the quick, decisive conflict the German staff predicted. Instead, it resembled the American Civil War, a long war of attrition and slaughter. By 1916, the death toll already was in the millions. Then British General Sir Douglas Haig conceived a plan to end the bloody stalemate by launching a gigantic assault along the River Somme. The plan was simple. The largest stockpile of artillery shells ever assembled would be fired in the biggest artillery bombardment ever to punch holes in the German wire and trenches. British troops would then walk over to take what was left of the German positions. That was the theory. To put this theory into practice, the British organized on an industrial scale. They built an entire transport system to bring artillery to the battlefield. Like the Prussians in the 19th century, they used railways. And now, with the arrival of the internal combustion engine, the British could call on wheeled and tracked vehicles of every possible size and shape to drag shells to the battlefield. Throughout the early summer of 1916, the British built camps, hospitals, water pumping stations, supply dumps, and truck depots, all supplied by road and rail. When the new technology stuck in the mud, old technology always was on hand. In 1815, Napoleon fought at nearby Waterloo with only 20,000 artillery shells. At the Somme, the British had 3 million. At dawn on June 26, 1916, the shelling began. From 18-pound shrapnel rounds to the massive 1,400-pound shells of the 15-inch howitzers, British artillery rained high explosive on the German positions in a bombardment planned to last a week. On day 2, they used a horrifying new weapon, poison gas. Chlorine gas seared the lungs, burned the skin, and blinded. Being heavier than air, it sank deep into the German trenches, penetrating every corner. The British bombardment lasted 7 days. The guns could be heard across the English Channel in London. On the 8th day, the guns fell silent. Then, at 6:30 a.m. on July 1st, the final and heaviest barrage was unleashed. Private Frank Hawkins of Queen Victoria's Rifles watched as the wooded area in front of him disappeared.
Whole trees were uprooted and flung into the air, and eventually the whole wood was in flames.
As he watched the destruction, Private Hawkins was given a tot of rum. Suddenly, the guns stopped. Silence fell over the trenches. The next thing Hawkins heard was the sound of platoon officers' whistles as their synchronized watches reached 7:30 a.m. It was time to go over the top. Across a front 20 miles long, 200,000 British soldiers climbed the ladders out of their trenches and headed across no man's land toward the Germans. The British officers led the charge, many armed with no more than a swagger stick or revolver. The 16th Northumberland Fusiliers followed a soccer ball kicked before them by a well-known player. That was how confident the British were that the artillery barrage had worked. But the Germans had dug their trenches deep. Many were still intact. When the bombardment stopped, German machine gunners grabbed their weapons and scrambled from their dugouts. Across the gently sloping open ground of no man's land, the British walked through a storm of bullets. Wave upon wave were mowed down. Some were killed the instant they stuck their heads above their own trenches. Others were cut to pieces as they stumbled through the tangled German wire. Of the 200,000 British who went over the top on July 1st, 1916, 20,000 died on the first day, most in the first hour. 40,000 were wounded, casualties of more than 1 in 3. It remains the single bloodiest day in Britain's long military history. The few men who reached the German front-line trenches were faced by 2 or more lines of reserve trenches still in place. The telephone wires hastily laid across no man's land were soon cut by German artillery. The British found themselves isolated, with no way forward and no way back. A few survivors struggled back to the British lines. Behind them in no man's land, the cries of the injured filled the air. They could not be collected until 3 days later, on July 4th. By then, most had died. The Battle of the Somme did not end on July 1st, or even July 4th. It lasted until November 18th. After 4 months, neither side had gained more than a few yards. 419,654 British soldiers were killed or wounded, along with almost 200,000 of their French allies and 650,000 Germans. Millions of shells had been fired, but the stalemate was unbroken. Both sides looked to new technology for a way through. One solution was the tank, a tracked, bulletproof box armed with machine gun and cannon, a trench-crossing weapon. This tank was slow and unreliable, but here was the future of ground war. And above the trenches, the air war of the future. By late 1918, Germany had been worn down by fighting on 2 fronts and by America's entry into the war. Her civilians were close to starvation, the First World War ground to a halt. On all sides, the casualty rate among infantry was 200, even 300%. The huge armies assembled in the summer of 1914 had been wiped out once and replaced, wiped out again and replaced, and wiped out a third time and replaced. "10 million soldiers lay dead. 21 million were wounded." In 1918, the German army could not fight on, but nor had it been decisively defeated. The peace treaty at Versailles stripped Germany of her army and navy. The economic crisis that followed bred deep resentment among many Germans. Among these was a member of the 16th Bavarian Reserves. At the Battle of Ypres in 1915, his regiment had been reduced from 3,600 men to 611. By 1916, he was one of a handful still alive. When the German army surrendered on November 11, 1918, against all odds, he was still alive. Corporal Adolf Hitler. The next war would be his. September 1940, London burns, pounded by Hitler's Luftwaffe. Dragged into the front line by German bombers, Londoners have a word for the fire that falls from the skies. The Blitz. Blitz is short for a German word the world has come to fear. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The war will drag on for 6 years, but new technologies of killing will be perfected at dizzying speed. Adolf Hitler had come to power as leader of Germany in 1933. He would settle the unfinished business of the First World War, and he would do it quickly. The strategy would be lightning war, a blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg depended on 2 weapons, the tank and the airplane. Since World War I, both had grown faster, bigger, and more lethal. And now they could be directed by a new technology, radio. Throughout the 1930s, generals had theorized about the impact of radio-directed formations of tanks and aircraft. Adolf Hitler's Germany was the first to put theory into practice. On September 1st, 1939, the Germans attacked Poland. They destroyed its army in weeks, its air force in a day. Poland's allies, Britain and France, declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. By spring 1940, Germany had overrun Poland, Holland, and Belgium. Now, once more, they faced the British and the French in northern France. Expecting trench warfare, the French had built a string of forts along the German border, the Maginot Line. They were ready to fight, but the days of trench warfare were over. No one believed tanks could get through, except the Germans. The Allies had an army of 2.5 million, but they were in the wrong place. The Germans' massed tanks smashed through. It only took 3 days. Blitzkrieg also introduced another way to overcome the enemy swiftly. Landing paratroopers behind enemy lines in Holland, the Germans further exploited the war potential of the airplane. As German tanks raced toward the Channel coast, they split the French and British armies in 2. Shattered by the sheer speed of the German assault, the Allies collapsed. The British withdrew back across the Channel. The French surrendered at Compiègne, in the same railway carriage where Germany had signed the surrender that ended the First World War. Blitzkrieg had triumphed. The aircraft and tank reigned supreme. Paris was Hitler's. British fighter planes resisted Hitler's Luftwaffe in the air. The Royal Navy protected Britain's vital shipping lanes. And it was onto the seas of the world that the Second World War now moved. With radar and aircraft, Britain fought a desperate battle against German U-boats in the Atlantic. But it was on the other side of the world, in the Pacific, that the aircraft's impact on war at sea was decisive. On December 7, 1941, 360 Japanese planes launched from 6 aircraft carriers attacked America's Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. It was a rerun of the Japanese blitz on the Russians at Port Arthur in 1904. In a single day, Japanese naval aircraft had disabled the Pacific Fleet for a year. 4 days later, Germany declared war on the United States. America was at war in 2 oceans with half its navy sunk. Yet Pearl Harbor was not as decisive as the Japanese hoped. During the raid, a handful of American ships were at sea, a critical handful: the aircraft carriers. It was a stroke of luck the Japanese would live to regret. 7 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese decided to attack an American base in the Hawaiian Islands. The island was called Midway. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and 11 battleships steamed toward Midway under Admiral Nagumo. Against them, Admiral Chester Nimitz had only 3 aircraft carriers: Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown. But Nimitz had one advantage over the Japanese. The Americans had broken their code, and he knew their plans. He decided to attack. In the early morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese aircraft bombed Midway and returned to their ships to rearm. As they did, the Americans launched their dive bombers and torpedo planes. It was a hazy morning in the Pacific. The American dive bombers lost their way. Only the torpedo planes found their target. As the American bombers dived to attack, Japanese fighters shot them down before they could score a single hit. Nagumo felt certain the Americans were beaten. The battle was all but over, but at 10:30 a.m., 36 American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers. With all their planes refueling and rearming on deck, the Japanese were sitting ducks. Enterprise's dive bombers screamed down to the attack. The flight decks of the Japanese carriers were covered with bombs and fuel. The result was devastating. By the end of the day, Japan's entire carrier force was wiped out. The Americans had lost one carrier, the Yorktown. On that day, Japan began to lose the war. Midway changed war at sea. Like war on land, naval warfare was now dependent on overwhelming power in the air. For 3 long years, Britain and America fought on at sea and in the air. But they did not fight on alone. They had an ally who would lose more men than Britain and America combined and multiplied by 10: Soviet Russia. On June 22, 1941, 3 million German troops threw themselves against Soviet Russia in Operation Barbarossa, the biggest land assault in history. It also was one of the cruelest. Hitler regarded the people of Eastern Europe as Untermenschen, subhumans unworthy of life. The Germans deliberately starved and neglected Russian prisoners of war. 3.5 million died in captivity. As the Nazis moved east, they rounded up the Jews of every town they captured. They were dragged from their homes, they were beaten, and they were herded into ghettos. For a people he despised, Hitler had a particular fate in mind, the final solution. In Russia, Hitler had come farther than any conqueror since Napoleon. In the north, his troops besieged Leningrad. And in the south, they stood outside a city whose name would live in the history of warfare, Stalingrad.